Hello, Royal High School Woodshop, and today our machine of the day is the Radial Arm Saw. Today's machine of the day is the Radial Arm Saw, and the Radial Arm Saw, along with the chop saw, are used for cross-cutting boards. Cross-cutting boards means that we're going to cut them across the grain. And when we do that, we have a choice to make. Which saw do we want to use? The chop saw or the radial arm saw? The radial arm saw has an advantage, and it has a specific type of board that it can cut for us, and that is wide boards. Right, here's a board that's about 10 inches wide. I've laminated some pieces together, and because it's so wide, the chop saw can no longer cut across this board. So I need another tool to be able to do that with, and that tool is the radial arm saw. Now, the radial arm saw is a pretty dangerous tool, and let me show you our main concern, right? Obviously, any machine has this similar kinds of ability to cut us, but the radial arm saw has a very specific safety issue that we want to be aware of. So the radial arm saw is a motor here with a blade attached over on this side, it has a guard over it, and then it has this long arm. Well, the motor and the blade attachment roll towards you along this arm. In fact, this is about a 15-inch distance. The blade can roll about 15 inches out here to the front of the saw and cut you, right? So that means if I was standing here like this, waiting for another machine to open up, and I place my hand in this red safety zone, that literally the blade and motor assembly could roll forward like that and roll right over the top of my hand. Now, there's no other machine in the shop where that could happen, right? In all of the other machines that we work with, the blade is stationary, and we have to push the board into the blade. If I stop pushing, that's it. The board's not going to travel into the blade any further. But in a radial arm saw, the safety risk is that if I don't use this correctly, that blade can roll awfully close, right? If I'm standing right here, that blade is really close to me, within several inches of my body. So we want to operate the radial arm saw safely, like any other machine. We just want to make sure we take some considerations seriously, we follow them, and we can use the radial arm saw without incident. Well, let's take a look really quickly at the parts of a radial arm saw. So the radial arm saw is going to sit on a big table, and actually down here below the table is a crank handle. That crank handle is going to allow me to raise and lower the saw blade. So a radial arm saw blade should sit down below the surface of the table about 1/8 of an inch only, right? So the radial arm saw is cutting down into this tabletop. You're going to slide your board over here, and the blade's going to pass over your board and cut through it. The blade should only be down into the table about 1/8 of an inch, and this arm right here, this crank handle, is where I'm going to adjust that. Right here in the front is the blade height adjusting crank handle, and that's going to let me raise or lower the height of the blade. Right here I have the motor assembly, and the motor assembly is on this carriage, and this allows the motor to do two things. Number one, the motor can swivel left and right. So the motor, right now the blade is cutting straight at me at 90 degrees to the fence, but this would allow me to loosen this carriage and turn it sideways, and now the blade would be cutting straight down the bench. That's because a radial arm saw is really a multifunctional tool. In many cases, they can be set up to do lots of the different jobs that are done by all these tools in the classroom. Now, that being said, that's very dangerous, and so here at Royal, we're not going to do it. The carriage is on a spring, and the carriage travels back and forth on this long arm, right? So by grabbing this handle, I can pull that motor carriage with the blade attached about 15 inches on this arm. that's giving it the name Radial Arm Saw. Now, up here, the saw also will allow me to tilt the arm to 45 degrees. So I can unlock, there's several locking mechanisms here. I could tilt the arm to about 45 degrees and I could make miter cuts with the Radial Arm Saw. Again, we're going to leave all of these locks and mechanisms locked. We're going to cross cut at 90 degrees with our Radial Arm Saw, and that's it. Now if we look at the Radial Arm Saw from the left side, we can see the guard that covers the blade, right? And in all cases, on all saws, there's only one way that we ever take a guard off, and that's when we've gotten permission from the teacher to remove it. The guard acts as a protector to your hands. It's going to just be one more thing in the way so that your hand can be deflected away from the saw in case there's any problem. There's a locking pin right here. This locking pin again would allow me to pull this out. If I raise the table, the blade assembly up, this blade assembly will tilt to 45 degrees. Now I can pull the saw out, cutting a bevel on the end of the board. Again, we're not going to use that feature, although it's there, because we have saws that are much safer now to do all of these tasks, and it keeps this dangerous saw doing one thing and one thing only, and that's cross-cutting. Now back here we also have the dust collector, and so there's a tube connected to it that goes into our dust collection system, and we want to make sure all of this is working well. Right here over the guard is basically it's a sawdust deflector, and it pushes the sawdust that is, right, some of the sawdust is going to go back, some of it's going to want to come forward because the blade is rotating. This is going to help deflect the sawdust off to the side, right? So this little right-angled piece of hose helps deflect the sawdust away. Please make sure it stays headed either to the left there or down towards the table. Not a lot of sawdust comes through here, but we do want to deflect it away from us. So right here on the table, we've painted the safety margin, right? This is the safety margin. I want to keep my hands 6 inches away from this blade. And so if I keep my hands outside of this red zone painted on the table, then I'm very likely to keep my hands out of the blade at all times. Keep your hands well outside the safety margin and you shouldn't have any problem with getting cut. So when I put a piece of wood up against a fence to make a cut on the Radial Arm Saw, it's going to be very important that the board is flat on the table and flat against the fence. I notice here that this board is not flat at all, and that can create a really big safety problem with the Radial Arm Saw. I could turn the board over. But I noticed that that doesn't solve the problem. This is a very twisted board. It's really unsafe to cut it on the Radial Arm Saw. I'm gonna throw it out, not gonna cut it. Here's another board that I'm gonna cut on the Radial Arm Saw. And when I put it up against the Radial Arm Saw, I noticed that right here at the cut point, there's a giant gap. The gap is almost 3/8 of an inch deep. That means that when I make a cut and the cut goes, the blade comes through the board is going to start to move like that. And as the board moves backwards, the two halves of the board are going to pinch together on the blade. That can cause the blade to jerk forward and create a dangerous situation where I get a climb cut or even a kickback, right? It might pick the board up and toss the board off. So that's a problem. When I make a cut on the Radial Arm Saw or a chop saw, I do not want there to be a gap between the fence and the board. There is one thing I can do to try to solve that problem, and that is turn the board over like that. As long as the board touches the fence right here where the cut is being made, I'm safe. Well, I turn the board over and I still see a gap. That means one side has a curve in it and the other side is a rough is the rough side of the board, and that side is not straight either. It's tapering, it's getting smaller and smaller. So there just is no safe way to cut this board against there without first going to another machine like the joiner and making one of the edges flat and straight. So I need to do that first before I cut this board. The first step on a radial arm saw would be that I'm going to take my stock that I'm going to cut and I want to put it up against the fence, right? And this is true on all machines. Stock goes against a fence to secure it, and it goes against the table surface, right? So I'm going to set the stock up against the table and the fence. And I would line the blade up with my pencil line, wherever it is the stock needs to be cut. Now, when I use a radial arm saw, I'm going to grab this handle right here, and I want to lock my elbow. Lock my elbow. That reminds me of the guys and gals that we see playing on the football team. When you see somebody playing football and they're trying to keep the defender from tackling them or throwing them out of the way, they put their elbow out like that, they put their arm out like that, and they lock their elbow. That's called the stiff arm technique. And so the same thing is true here. What I don't want is I don't want this blade assembly to jerk forward faster than I can react and get really close to me or cut me. So when I grab that handle, I'm going to lock my elbow. That's going to keep me arm's length away from the blade. And now as I work with this board, I keep that elbow locked the entire time. The whole way out and the whole way back, I keep my elbow locked. Now, the motor and blade assembly is on a spring. So when I pull it out, if I were to lose control of that, it wants to pull back to the back. But I don't ever rely on the spring to do that. After I've made my cut, I don't let go until I return the whole blade motor assembly to the very rear of the machine. And then when I turn this machine on and when I turn this machine off, my hand has to be on that handle, so that if I turn it on and there are some little scrap pieces of wood down in the little groove on the tabletop, the blade motor assembly can't start to roll at me. If my hand is not on the machine and I turn it on and the motor starts spinning, the whole thing could roll at me because there's some issue. So as we've learned, a radial arm saw is a reason it's dangerous is because it cuts in the wrong direction. It does what's called a climb cut. So the blade is literally trying to roll forward up onto the board and at me. That's not really how the blade should be cutting. I really should be pushing the saw towards the back. However, when radial arm saws were built many years ago, that technology was not available. So we just know when we cut with a radial arm saw, we're doing a climb cut, we're cutting in the wrong direction. It makes it a bit more dangerous. What that also means is there's a likelihood that if something were to go wrong, the blade will roll into the board and get stuck. Now, I want you to hear what the machine is going to sound like if the blade is stuck in the machine, right? So I'm cutting, all of a sudden something goes wrong, the blade gets stuck in the board, and the blade is not moving. Here's what it's going to sound like. Crickets, right? Silence, nothing. In fact, you're going to be tempted to think that the machine is off. That's what it's going to appear like. However, as soon as I free the blade is going to begin spinning again. So if I go to make this cut, the blade gets stuck, it appears that the machine is off. If I go to mess with it and I break the blade free of the board, it's going to start right back up spinning. Meanwhile, my hand is down there in the midst of it trying to mess around with it. So if the blade gets stuck in the board, my first job is to simply reach up here and make sure I hit the off button. Hit the off button, right? Doesn't matter that you can't hear anything. It doesn't matter that the blade is not spinning. If the blade seems to be stuck midway into the board, then my first job is to reach up here and turn the machine off. And my second job is to back away from the machine and go get the teacher, go get the instructor. Okay, I don't want to mess with it without the teacher here, so we can make sure there's no injury. Now, another rule on the radial arm saw is that when I make a cut on the radial arm saw, I should be standing, whenever possible, on the right side of the machine over here. Why is that? Well, I'm going to grab, when I stand on the right side of the machine, I'm going to grab the handle with my left hand. I'm going to pull the blade through the cut or the board. I'm going to return the blade to the back. I'm going to reach up and turn the machine off. And never in any of that time was any part of my body ever in front of the blade, so that if the blade rolled forward, I was in danger of getting cut. However, if I stand over here on the left side of the machine and I make the cut, the same cut, this arm right here is laying across the path of the blade. So the chance of me getting cut or injured goes up a lot. What's the safety rule? The safety rule is, whenever possible, you should be standing on the right side. Do all the work on a radial arm saw from the right side. No part of your body should be in front of the path of the blade. Now, when I finish the cut on a radial arm saw, this poses the most dangerous, one of the most dangerous moments in the cut, because I'm tempted to reach across the path of the blade to pick up my scrap piece of wood or my piece that I need so I can walk away. And again, anytime I put my hand in front of the blade, I have a chance that I can cut it off. Remember, the blade isn't stationary. The blade isn't locked right there, and I have to put my hand into the blade. If I reach across the path of the blade and there's a piece of scrap back in there that causes the blade to go like this and roll forward, the blade can roll right over the top of my arm. So another of our safety rules for the radial arm saw would be that I never, ever reach across the path of the blade. I never reach across the path of the blade. Once I complete the cut on the radial arm saw, I have a little piece of scrap wood right here, and my tendency is going to be to want to reach across the path of the blade to get that little piece of scrap. I'm not going to do that. What I want to do is I want to take the bigger board and I want to use it to push the little scrap outside the red zone, the safety zone. Now I can walk around the safety zone and pick up the scrap piece, and I can go back to my seat, and never once did I have to reach with my hand across the path of the blade. Well, when I reach up and turn the radial arm saw off, I want to make sure I'm holding on to the handle. Once I can hear it slowing down, I can let go. Once I hear the radial arm saw slowing down, it's okay for me to let go. However, I want to stay here till I know for sure the saw has stopped spinning. I never want to walk away with the radial arm saw blade spinning. There's a chance that when I went to turn the saw off, I actually hit the on button. So if I hit the on button and then pick up my board and walk away, I now leave the saw blade here spinning, and it makes a very dangerous situation, right? Because if somebody were to walk up here using the router over here and stand like this waiting for the router table to become available, this blade is spinning. There's a chance that it could get wedged in there and all of a sudden roll forward like that over the top of somebody's hand. So once I'm done with my cut, I never walk away till I know for sure the blade is stopped. Now, another little dangerous piece of the radial arm saw are the pieces that get cut off. That little tiny scrap piece is going to get cut off, and it's going to get thrown into this dust collector. That also means that all of that scrap can get wedged in between the blade and the little groove that the blade sits in, and now that's what's going to cause the blade to jerk forward at me at some point. So I always want to be careful with that. If I note that I've cut some little pieces and they went back in that box, I might even want to turn the saw off, wait till it comes to a stop, get that scrap out of there. But I need to remember that it's the scrap, it's the little pieces, the little chips of wood that end up back in the dust collector that pose a problem. Those little pieces can get wedged down on the table next to the blade, and that can cause the blade to roll forward at me. Well, I'm ready to make my cut here on my stock. So it's wide stock, which means the saw that I have to use to rough cut it to length is the Radial Arm Saw. Notice I'm standing completely to the right side, and I've taken the stock, put it flat on the table, and pushed it tight up against the fence. I've also checked by pulling the blade forward slightly, and I've checked to make sure that my saw blade is cutting on the correct side of the pencil line. Remember, we never cut directly on top of the pencil line. We always want to be off to one side. So I'm ready to make the cut. Now what you're going to see me do is grab the handle, turn the saw on, wait for it to come up to full speed. Using the stiff arm technique, I'm going to gently and slowly pull the saw through the stock while kind of resisting, holding back on the saw so that it can't jerk forward and climb onto my board. Once I get the saw completely through the board, then while still using the stiff arm technique, I'm going to go ahead and push the saw all the way back to its resting position. And then I'm going to take this hand and reach up and turn the saw off so I can hear the motor starting to slow down. And only at that point will I let go. And then I remember, right, the other big safety issue that I'm tempted to do is reach across the path of the blade to grab my piece that I cut off. And so you'll see me not do that. I'm literally going to walk all the way around the red safety zone, get my piece of wood, come back, and then I'm ready to take my stock and go back to my seat. So let's do it. Let me show you how to make this cut. Now remember, as with all saws, we got safety glasses on. People with long hair have their long hair back and kept and put up so that there's no possible way for that long hair to end up in this saw. Those people that have on things like jewelry or a necktie or lanyards or earbuds or maybe strings on a hoodie, that all gets put away, tucked in, or taken off. I don't have a baggy flannel shirt over the top of my my dress shirt here. I've tucked my shirt in, and there's no baggy shirt that's going to get caught up in there as the cut is being made. So I've made sure to take care of all those safety rules that I've seen on all the other machines. They all apply here. The other safety rule that I'm doing here is I'm standing to the right side of the saw so that no part of my body is in front of the path of the blade. All right, let's make our cut. All right, so with the piece of material cut, I'm going to walk around. I use the big piece of wood to push the little piece out of the red zone, and I walk around and pick up my scrap piece, and now I'm ready to get my stock and head back to my table to keep working on my project. So I have a board here I'd like to cut that's about 2.5 inches thick. Radial arm saws can cut boards to a depth of about 2 to 3 inches in general, and they can cut boards between 12 and 15 inches wide. I run into a little bit of a problem on the radial arm saw when I go to cut boards that are thick. So in this case, this board about 2.5 inches in thickness, I've got a slight problem, and that is that right back here in the back upper corner, the board is touching the blade. The board is touching the blade, which means I can't turn the machine on. I never want to turn the machine on while the board is in contact with the blade. So in the case of a radial arm saw, or it could be another saw, what I need to do is I need to scoot the board forward, right, from the fence. I need to create a sub-fence. And I can do that with a spacer. So here I have two pieces of wood. They're exactly the same thickness. And I'm going to set them in here. I'm going to scoot the board forward. Then I'm going to drop that spacer down in here against the fence. Push the board back against the fence. Now the board is secure. It's sitting up against the fence, only there's a tiny little spacer in between the fence and the board here and here. So it's still secure. But now when I look right back in here where the board was touching the blade, it's all clear. So now I'm ready to make my cut. However, I need to recall that this is a 2.5 inch thick board. I better not pull it quite as fast as I did in a little tiny 3/4 inch board. So it's over 2 times the thickness of the board that I previously cut. All right, so we've successfully cut through the 2.5 inch thick board. That's the correct way that I would use the radial arm saw to cross cut a large piece of stock. And what I'm doing is rough cutting it so that it's now smaller and I can go to the machines and start to work with it. The final cuts on all my material has to be done at a different machine. This machine is generally not accurate. If you were to put a tri-square on the cut made by the radial arm saw, you would notice that it's not straight. So we don't want to use this for nice cuts and cuts that have to be accurate. We only use it for rough cutting giant boards that are especially wide into smaller manageable pieces that can be used on other machines. Well, I'll see you next time when we look at another machine in the Royal High School Wood Shop.